Okay, wonderful. So thank you all for joining us today for this event where we're going to talk about journaling for mental health challenges and issues. And my name is Rafi Al Mansour, and I'm a therapist by profession. But today's workshop is also being sponsored by Therapy Journal, which is a company that I'm one of the founders of. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is before we get deeper into the topic for today. So to get started, um, we were actually hoping to make these more interactive, but unfortunately the way that it was set up as a webinar. So you guys can use the chat box to ask any questions. You could also use the Q&A feature, and I'd be happy to answer any questions as we go. But unfortunately, we can't make this more interactive in the sense that you guys can't have your cameras on and to ask questions in person, but that's okay. So for today, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. Again, my name is Rafi Al Mansour, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I live in Maryland. I work in Northern Virginia, and I work in a small private practice here called Wellness Through Counseling. I've been at this practice since 2018, and I see individuals, couples, and families. But probably my specialty is more working with couples as well as individual males, just because there's a shortage of therapists in general, but there's even less or fewer male therapists. And just I don't market myself as catering to specifically Muslims, but in our practice, we do see a lot of Muslim clients as well. At least I do. There's a fairly large Muslim population in the DC metro region. Apart from that, I'm also a supervisor for what's an organization called the Together Program, which is a program run through the University of Maryland that offers 6-week couples workshops on financial stress management. And so these are co-facilitated by both a therapist as well as a financial counselor. And it's a program that's completely free. It's sponsored by a government grant. Unfortunately, participants do have to be in the DC area, so either DC, Maryland, or Virginia. But it's a free program. It's wonderful. They're not sponsoring this event, but I always like to let people know that this is an option and a resource that's available. I'm also the former chair now of the Couples Interest Network of AAMFT. And lastly, I'm the founder and CEO of Therapy Journal. So just to talk a little bit about what that is, and then we'll talk about what we're going to cover today. There we go. So Therapy Journal is a therapy companion app for both therapists and clients. As far as clients go, what Therapy Journal allows you to do is to really document your experience in therapy. So whether that means taking notes after your session so you can remember what was talked about, or actually just jotting down experiences that happen outside of therapy so that way you can use it in your sessions. You can also share your entries with your therapist if you add them. And that way your therapist can be kind of in the loop of what's happening with you and anything that's in a written form that you'd want them to know. And we also have a library of clinical journaling templates that are focused on how to approach different types of issues, from anxiety to boundaries, communication, all sorts of different emotions. And so through the process of creating this library, which much of this is rooted in either some principles of cognitive behavioral therapy or really just experiences that I've had with clients where maybe I see certain patterns and I want to kind of capture that into a journaling process. And so we've created templates that could come from that inspiration as well. And that's kind of where the inspiration for this webinar series is coming from too. I've had an opportunity to kind of put some of this stuff together. And so we wanted to make it more publicly accessible to others as well. And so we'll talk about some of that today. As far as Therapy Journal goes for therapists, some of the features that are here that help therapists in their work, here we go, is one is it's a platform for therapists to take what's called private psychotherapy notes. So for those of you that are therapists, you probably already know what this is, but just to talk about it, clinicians have to take what's called progress notes, which is basically just short summaries of what happens every session, which is part of the client's medical record. But clinicians can also take private psychotherapy notes, which are like their own private reflections as they're working with their clients. And so these are things that are actually separate from the client's record. And so we're creating Therapy Journal as a platform where clinicians can use our app for things like general reflections, session planning, organizing any kind of goals or themes that are coming up and that you want to remember, processing your own feelings that can come up, or otherwise known as countertransference types of issues, as well as just taking general administrative notes. And apart from that, clinicians can also assign any relevant journaling templates to their clients if they're noticing any particular challenges or issues. Okay, so that's what we are. I won't spend too much more time there. If you want to download the app or look at it, it's only on iOS right now, unfortunately. We are working on Android, but I'll put the link to the website. Let's see, Therapy Journal app. That didn't come as a link. There we go. So you can go there to learn more or to download the app from the website. So for today, the outline for today, I want to cover how you can use journaling most effectively, specifically for different types of issues and challenges. And our hope is that we want to make this kind of a series that we'll host every week, or we will try to do it every week, and we'll cover different issues at each webinar. Today, we're going to actually cover what was covered last time. We looked at the attendee list, and I think the names were different. So we thought it would be helpful just to do the first initial webinar that we did last time, which covers kind of some of the more foundational aspects of journaling. So today we're going to talk about journaling with regards to emotions in general. We're going to talk about journaling about boundaries. And if we have time, we ran out of time last time, we want to also talk about goal setting and motivation. And so we do want to make this an experiential workshop, which means that we'll leave some time for you guys to actually journal during the webinar today. So have your journals handy if you like to journal by hand or whatever medium you use. And if you don't have one in particular and you want to try the app of Therapy Journal, please, we'd love for you guys to experience it there as well. And some of the templates we're going to talk about are actually in the app, so it'll make it convenient. As far as discussion goes, that's if you guys want to share anything, you don't have to. You could share it in the chat box or ask questions. And we also wanted to make this an open AMA where you can ask questions to me if you have any specific questions. I'm happy to answer them, whether related to journaling or just mental health in general. Okay, let's see. Any questions so far? I don't think so. All right, wonderful. Can I also ask, is anyone here a therapist or a clinician? If so, you can just kind of drop it into the chat box. That way it'll help me to know if I want to talk about any things from that perspective. Okay, so here we go. So first, I want to talk about journaling and therapy and kind of how they're related. So as far as journaling goes, or therapy goes, I like to think of therapy as an art of both compassion and curiosity. Right? It's about being asked thoughtful questions to understand the things that will make our lives better and more complete. And compassion really is synonymous with understanding, that when you can understand someone or something, then you're able to be more empathetic and compassionate towards them. Whereas if you can't understand them, then we tend to jump to judgment and more critical types of thoughts. And so to build understanding, obviously, you need to have also curiosity, a desire to try to understand. And so in therapy, that's kind of what's happening in the relationship between a client and their therapist. The therapist is trying to understand what's going on for their client, and through that process, build a level of understanding, which the therapist will use to have compassion towards them, but also the client is then able to have compassion towards themselves, because they're not just beating themselves over the head for not messing up for the 10th time on the same issue, but they're actually understanding, why is this happening? What's causing these problems to continue to reemerge in my life? And so in a similar way, journaling is a private medium that helps us to explore our inner selves and put words to the things that matter to us. but in the form of writing rather than being spoken out loud with another person. And so journaling can be a really powerful tool. That's why people always encourage it. It's why many people make habits of it, to do it either regularly or do it when they feel that their emotions or their life is becoming unmanageable. However, there are some challenges of open journaling. So really the big challenge is that we're not being guided by a perspective outside of our own. Excuse me. Whereas in therapy, right, your therapist is acting as the guide, right, that helps you to know what to explore and what to think about. But with journaling, you're kind of just left on your own, at least with open journaling. And so when we're the ones that are experiencing the suffering of our problems, then it's hard to detach from that suffering to kind of, see the forest for the trees, right? We're kind of caught in the weeds of the struggle, so we don't always know how to get out of it. And that's the challenge with journaling that often comes up. There's a therapist by the name of Kay Adams, who's also the founder of the Therapeutic Journaling Institute, where she talks about this issue, where people that have experienced, big traumas or have a hard time managing their emotions internally, that when you just free write and you're writing about those pains, you're delving deeper into them, but you're not necessarily finding a way out of them or coming to a place that's letting you feel better. So sometimes people actually feel worse after journaling. And let's see. Yep. And this is kind of again, the value of having a therapist is that they act as guides to help facilitate a way out. So you're not just left there. And so as far as journaling goes, what we are, one of the benefits of guided journaling is that you're being asked questions that will help you kind of find a way out and make those difficult emotions or experiences productive and constructive. So we're going to talk about that today. So I'm going to unshare my screen. I think this is the end of this presentation. Okay, let's see. Go ahead and stop share. Okay, so I'm going to talk about now, talking about emotions. One second, there we go. All right, so we want to try to, our next prompt is going to be journaling about the emotions that we experience. And before we talk about that, I want to talk about one of the benefits of using journaling, which is to develop what's called an internal locus of control. And to define it, I'm going to first start by talking about an external locus of control, which is when we try to control things that are outside of ourselves to help ourselves feel better. So rather than managing ourselves, which is having an internal locus of control, we try to change other people or change the circumstances that we're in, which isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes we need to do that, but it becomes problematic when that's the only approach that a person takes. Rather, an internal locus of control is when we work to manage our own thoughts or our own feelings and behaviors as a way of coping with whatever challenge that we're going through. So to be able to do that, to develop an internal locus of control, we have to build a relationship between ourselves and the emotions that we experience, the thought patterns that we have, as well as the behaviors and reactions that we tend to do. So to do that, to increase our ability to manage emotions, thoughts, and behaviors, it helps to first build a recognition of yourself independent of those things, right? To recognize that ultimately who you are is not your thoughts, it's not your emotions, and it's not your behaviors. But, and this is a concept talked about in a book called The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, where he explains that really who we are at the core is the person or the entity that lives behind the thoughts and behind the feelings and behind the behaviors. So we're actually the one that is always the observer or the one that experiences the emotions. So that when you're feeling angry, you're not anger itself, but you're experiencing anger. You can feel the anger or you can feel the anxiety. Even when it comes to our thoughts, there's this kind of relationship between me being the subject and everything else being the object that I'm witnessing or experiencing. And so even when it comes to thoughts, you're the one that's listening to those thoughts, right? You're almost hearing those thoughts, just like right now, you're hearing my voice as I'm speaking, right? You know that you're not me, but you're experiencing my voice. And similarly, you can experience your own thoughts and you can experience your own emotions. And really, everything in the universe has this relationship between you being the one that experiences and the object itself. So in relation to emotions, the first thing that you want to be able to do is just to recognize those emotions that you're feeling, right? And we're experiencing emotions at any given point in time, probably multiple emotions. It could be emotions like curiosity, it could be emotions like anxiety, maybe it's feeling contentment and peace, maybe it's excitement, but there's hundreds of emotions that you could be feeling, and you want to try to recognize what you're feeling at that moment. So that's the first step, identifying what it is you're feeling. And just by labeling what you're feeling, it helps you to build a detachment, to a healthy detachment between that emotion itself. So that's number one. What am I feeling? Then number two, right? So now that you recognize what you're feeling in the moment, what do you do with that? So the next key piece is to figure out what those emotions represent. So emotions reflect our values at the end of the day, meaning that they reflect the things that we care about and the things that are meaningful to us. And that if something wasn't meaningful to us, then we wouldn't actually feel any kind of an emotional response to it. It would be something that wouldn't have the power to evoke anything. But when something does matter, then we'll usually feel some kind of emotion when something happens or is relevant regarding that thing. So the next step after you understand what you're feeling is to figure out, why am I feeling this? Like, what does this emotion represent? Right? If I'm feeling anxious, let's say, what is it that might be feeding into my anxiety? And that's not always easy to do. Sometimes it's hard to recognize the source of our emotions, and it can be difficult. Sometimes we misplace what the emotion represents onto something else, when really the emotion is really stemming from a different issue. And so really, this is where journaling can be very powerful, because it forces you to kind of sit still and sit with yourself and be curious about yourself to understand what those emotions might mean. Okay, so you can identify what you're feeling and why you're feeling that way. Now, unfortunately, many people, they stop at this level, at this step, but and sometimes that's enough, right? Just recognize why you're feeling it. But usually there's another layer and another level for us to get to. Okay, so the second one is the third step is to be able to recognize what the purpose of that emotion is. Meaning, what is it that that emotion is ultimately needing from me to feel better? And even the word emotion, the English word emotion, comes from a Latin word which means to move. And that's because the idea about emotions is that they're there to motivate us, that they're a source of motivation, either to move towards something or away from something, to take some kind of an action to address what that emotion is representing. And so you can think about any emotion, and there's a process of trying to uncover what is the relevant need to it. And so one of the examples I always like to talk about is the difference between guilt and regret. A lot of times we can mix these two emotions up, but they're actually two different emotions for two different situations, even though sometimes we do feel both of them. But guilt, right? Guilt happens when we violate some value or principle that we have. And we do this knowingly, right? For whatever reason, right? Maybe there's another motive that we have, but we know that by doing it, we're violating something else that we'd like to abide by. And so guilt is there to alert us that that's happening, but ultimately to push us back to being in alignment with our values. That's the purpose of guilt. And in addition to pushing us back to be in alignment with our values, what guilt needs a lot of times is also atonement, right? Or forgiveness, either from others or from oneself, as well as making a commitment, right, to stay in line with what those values are. Now compare this with regret, right? Regret happens when when knowing what we know today, that we wish we had done something differently in the past. But this doesn't necessarily mean that what we did in the past was a violation of our values. maybe we did what we thought was best, but we just come to find out that, hey, I could have made a better decision back then, which would have led to a better outcome right now. And so regret is different in the sense that it's not telling us, it's not trying to push us to be in line with our values because we never stepped outside of them. Instead, what regret is needing is for us to recognize any lessons from the past. So if there's anything that we could learn from this experience that we can carry with us for the future, as well as it's needing acceptance, right? So acceptance of what has happened and how to find peace with where things are today. And that until we get to acceptance, you're going to be stuck in regret. And so that's why, in these ways, it's important to understand for every single emotion, what is it that that emotion is needing in order to feel better. Okay, so on that note, we're going to now do our first journaling prompt. And let's see, I'll share my screen so you guys can see it here. Okay. So this. There we go. Okay, so this is just a little view of our app. So in the course library, under the preparing for therapy section, we have lesson 1, feelings. And so this this is a very simple prompt, but it walks us through the same 3 lessons that we just talked about, which is identifying what you're feeling, identifying what that emotion, that feeling is representing, and then recognizing what that feeling is needing to feel better. And so I'm going to give you guys about, let's say, let's give about 6 minutes to do this. So it's 1:23 over here, so we'll go to 1:29 if you're on the East Coast. So go ahead and whatever you're using, follow this prompt where first you identify what you're feeling and try to pick at least 2, maybe 3 emotions. And then for each emotion, for the next part, write down, I'm feeling this way because, why, and then write why you're feeling it. And then lastly, write down what you think that that emotion is needing. Okay, so we'll go to the 30-minute mark. If you're just joining us, we're doing our first journaling exercise. And so you can follow the prompt on the screen and use this template for journaling. We're going to go for about 4 more minutes until the 30-minute mark. Okay, so go ahead and finish up what you're writing if you still are. And if you want to share any thoughts or reflections, either with me directly or with everyone, feel free to post that in the chat box. If you have any questions, you feel free to ask as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about emotions, we want to talk about boundaries. So in talking about the relationship between them, right? So emotions reflect our values and they help to uncover our needs and how we can get those needs met. Now, sometimes these needs require something from others that for us to get these needs met, we need the cooperation of someone else to help get these needs fulfilled. And similarly, sometimes other people have their own needs as well and can demand or need something from us to help get their needs met. And so in the intersection between these two different people or two different entities and their needs, there are boundaries, right? In terms of how getting one person's needs met can affect the other person and their needs. And um, so sometimes, right, there can be a lot of harmony there. If there can be a lot of synchronicity where those needs complement each other and we can be in harmony. But other times, there can be conflict or issues if those boundaries aren't being managed in a healthy way. And so today, in today's modern world, balancing boundaries really is an essential, need that everyone needs to focus their attention on to some extent. And so when it comes to boundaries, sometimes boundaries can be either too loose or too soft, or they can be too rigid. And so loose boundaries are when we allow other people to kind of impose on us more than is healthy or necessary. And so what this oftentimes leads to is that it leads to us neglecting our own needs in order to get the needs met of others, that we prioritize others ahead of ourselves. Um, and when that happens, a lot of times it leads to people feeling overwhelmed or their own needs being neglected. And there's reasons for that, and there's ways to work through that. And at the same time, sometimes we can have rigid boundaries, which is when we have a very hard wall up between the needs of others and what we do to kind of help get those needs met. And similarly, we also then don't rely on other people to get our needs met because we keep such hard walls up between us and them. And what this leads to can be an over-reliance on oneself, right? So while it's good to be independent, it's better to be interdependent, meaning that you can both look after your own needs, but also cooperate and work with others that are meaningful to you to get needs met in a cooperative way. But when you can't do that, right, you have to rely solely on yourself. And it also prevents vulnerability with others, right? And a lack of connection with people that otherwise would be better for us to have a connection with. So both loose boundaries and rigid boundaries can be problematic. And so it's important to try to understand where are my boundaries too strong and where are they too weak or too fluid. And so also one other reflection when it comes to boundaries are that boundaries are not just with individuals or people, but really with anything outside of ourselves. This could be work or any kind of organizations. You can have boundaries with inanimate objects, things like technology. I think most people need to, manage their boundaries with things like their cell phones. Maybe it's, Netflix or, video streaming services. Similarly, you can have boundaries with food, boundaries with things like drugs and alcohol, boundaries with sleep. So really any entity that you have a relationship with, whether a person or anything else, there's a boundary there. And we have to attend to those and look after them. But to be able to do that, we first have to recognize what our boundaries are and where there's room for growth. So this again leads to our next exercise, which is on managing boundaries. So let me share my screen here. Okay. So our next template is going to be on assessing boundaries. So the purpose of this journaling prompt is just to recognize what our boundaries look like. So to start, right, the first question you want to ask yourself is what relationships are important to me, right? So this could be relationships with maybe a partner or a spouse. It could be a relationship with work, any object. So first, you want to jot down a few things that are important to you. So let's go and we'll do this one together, one step at a time. So take about a minute and just make a list of 2 or 3 different people or entities that you want that are important to you. Okay. So now that you've identified a few people or relationships that are important, now I want you to focus on the second part of this prompt, which is to identify any strengths that you have in the boundaries with those relationships. So think up here about what are the things that I'm doing or the habits or tendencies I have in place, which are actually healthy and appropriate. Um, and so if it's something like, let's say your cell phone, right? Maybe you've learned that, hey, when I charge my phone at night and I put it not right under my pillow, but I put it on the dresser. So it's a little bit further away from me, right? That's a good habit where I'm managing that boundary with my phone there. Or maybe it's a, boundary with your spouse that, you will, make an effort, at least once a week to go out on a date night or to spend some quality time together. Maybe this is a sibling and you make it a habit to call them, once a day or every few days. So it's important to first start with recognizing what's working, not just where are the problems, but what's worked for me today. What am I doing that's working that I want to keep up? So take another, say, 2 minutes and do this second part of the prompt. And I'm going to do this myself too, so I'm doing it along with you guys. Okay, so now we're going to go to the third part of this exercise, which is for you to reflect now on where your boundaries can be either too loose or too rigid with the relationships that you listed above. And in doing this, you want to think both about, let's say in the case of loose boundaries, right, where either you're letting the other person or entity demand too much of you in any kinds of ways. This could be in terms of things that they're expecting you to get done, or sometimes even just emotional demands. Are they sharing too much with me? Are they expecting me to carry too much of the emotional burden that they carry? But also to think about, are there any ways that I'm also imposing on them, right? Am I expecting too much of them, in a way that's coming at a cost to them, as far as loose boundaries go? And for rigid boundaries, you want to think about, where is it that I'm not having enough openness in this relationship, that it's leading to us not being able to get our own needs met in a more healthy way. So this can take a little more reflection. So go ahead and take at least maybe 4 or 5 minutes to work through this. Okay, and then, keep working on this if you are. But I'm going to go and choose the last part, which is now to, based off of where your boundaries are either too loose or too rigid, and in what ways. Now I want you to think about, what are the consequences of the boundaries being either too loose or too rigid. So think about, what you identified as far as what's maybe not an ideal or healthy boundary, and think about the ways that this then goes on to impact or affect you. And also reflect not just on how it's impacting you, but also think about how it's impacting uh, the person or the entity on the other side as well. Okay, so I know this was a little bit of a longer prompt, and takes us a little bit deeper to do this. It makes you really reflect on your relationships and how healthy or unhealthy they might be. Again, if you have any thoughts about this, if you find it helpful or any challenges or any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box or to post it in the Q&A. Okay. So on that note, now I know we're at 147, so we have a little bit of time left. We'll try to go to our last one on motivation. Let me stop sharing my screen. Okay. So when it comes to motivation, right? Um, motivation oftentimes is either comes from either a positive or a negative source. So it's either positive motivation or negative motivation. Positive meaning that it's coming from uh, some hope, right? There's hope for some kind of a desired outcome that you want, or negative motivation, which is coming from a place of fear, right? Fear of some kind of an unwanted outcome. And so either if it's positive, then you're looking forward to the pleasure of something that feels good. Or if it's negative motivation, then it's trying to avoid the pain of something that you know will hurt. And so in a simple way, motivation is either positive or negative. So for right now, when we're talking about goal setting, we're going to focus mostly on negative motivation. And so going back to emotions, right, you can use your feelings as well as any imbalances in the boundaries that you have as a launching point of understanding some of the problems in your life. And so recognizing problems is a prerequisite to healthy or productive goal setting. So you can look at where are problems emerging and what kinds of consequences are they having. And now then once you can recognize those, then you can go on to recognize the goals that will be helpful. Now, a lot of times when it comes to facing problems, this can be really difficult and really hard. Um, precisely because it's painful, because when we confront the realities of our life that are not working well for us and are having consequences, that can be hard to sit with. And it can leave you feeling helpless. It can leave you feeling ashamed or guilty. It can make you feel down on yourself. It can lead to you being critical of yourself. And so it's not easy to do that. And people usually often lean between one of two tendencies. And so there's something known as attachment styles. Many people know what this is. I won't go into too much depth about it, but attachment styles are really about how we relate to other people and as well as with ourselves. And so people can be on one side, they can have an avoidant attachment style. And this is when people avoid, let's talk about relationships, right? When there's conflict with another person or any kinds of negative emotions, their tendency is to turn away from that conflict, right? They want to avoid that relationship or in that moment at least, because it causes them some kind of pain or discomfort. So this is known as an avoidant attachment style. Now, people can have that relationship, that avoidant style, not just with other people, but even within themselves. Meaning that when an avoidant person recognizes some kinds of problems or challenges, rather than leaning into it, their tendency is to lean away from it and maybe compartmentalize or block off that part of their lives that causes them any kind of discomfort or pain. Um, and so the tendency for an avoidant person, again, is to avoid. Now, the other attachment style is known as an anxious attachment style. And this is someone that tends to get overly attached, right, when there's any kind of sources of pain or discomfort. And so when it comes to a relationship, when they feel like there's a problem there, their tendency is to want to talk about it and resolve it and address it right away. So that way they can get to a place of peace because that relationship is very important to them. So rather than turning away, they turn towards, and it gets more intense for them. And similarly, that type of attachment style can also be how they relate within themselves as well. So that if there's something that's causing them problems, rather than blocking it out like the avoidant style person, their tendency is to become more hyperfixated on that issue. So they'll think about it more and more, and they'll try to do something about it. And so, both of these styles, it's not that one is inherently better or worse than the other, or even that they're both necessarily bad, but it's good just to recognize what our tendencies are, because anytime you do something too much, right, it can cause problems. And so usually for the avoidant person, their area of growth is to focus more on what's the problem at hand. And for the anxious person is to be able to learn how to detach from the things that are causing them any kind of discomfort, and to block off in a healthy way. So yeah, so let's see. For time's sake, let's just leave it there. Let's see. I'll talk about the rest of the points as we go into our journaling exercise. So for the challenge with the avoidant person is that they don't sit enough with the things that are causing them problems. For the anxious person, it's that maybe they can fixate on what the problem is, but they're not able to sometimes come to a solution or recognize what they can do about it. A lot of times that's what leads to the external locus of control, where they'll try to change others or the situation rather than managing their own emotions to feel better. But for healthy goal setting, you want to first recognize the problems that you have, even though it can be difficult. And so let's see, let me share my screen. So now we're going to go into this library, recognizing problems. And so in this prompt, it's a simple prompt, so it shouldn't take too long, but it's not always an easy one, which is to actually recognize the problems that you're currently facing in your life. So you've done the feelings log, you've assessed your boundaries. These should give you some good clues, a good sense of direction into any kinds of problems. And so go ahead and now make a list, right, of the problems that you can identify in your life, followed by how severe of a problem that problem is, from 1 to 5. So think about 5 as like the most severe. These are the things that are causing you lots of consequences, and impeding your quality, lowering your quality of life, and causing you a lot of harm, essentially. And 1 would be things that are, it's a problem, but maybe it's not really causing that much inconvenience. You can live with it. Maybe at some point you'll get around to it. So take about 2 minutes or so and make a list of the problems that you're experiencing, as well as how severe those problems currently are. Also, in this exercise, I think there's a tendency for people to want to make every problem a level 5 problem, because it almost feels wrong not to call it as severe of a problem as you feel like it really is. But really try to reserve level 5 for the biggest of problems, whether very urgent or very big in consequence. Okay, so in our last few minutes now, we're going to shift over into our very last prompt, which goes hand in hand with the problems template, which is resolutions. So now that you've identified the problems, you want to use those to guide any kinds of goals or resolutions that you want to make for yourself. And so the prompt reads, the following changes or actions would make the biggest impact on my life, followed by the motivation level for change from 1 to 5. So in addition to identifying a goal, you want to be honest with yourself and recognize right now in the moment, how motivated do you feel to actually take this goal on? 5 means you're eager, you're itching, and you want to get started on this right away, right now, or as soon as you possibly can. And 1 would be maybe there's a little bit of motivation there, you feel it, but it's maybe not, it's definitely not at the top of your priority list. So go ahead and take about 2 minutes to do this, and then we're going to wrap up for the day. Okay. So it was a pleasure to be able to host this webinar for you guys. If you have, again, any feedback or any questions, please feel free to share it with me directly or with the group as a whole. And if you are on the app, there is one more template in this first section called the gratitudes template. And so this is something on your own time you can do if you'd like. When it's very simple, it's just asking you to say, today I'm grateful for, and list at least 4 things that you're grateful for. And this is just to, I think a lot of the things that we explored today are very heavy, and they require you to look at a lot of challenges and issues. And so it's important to be able to also sometimes step out of just those problems and focus on things that are going well. I like to call this to kind of changing the channel, right? How do you, we're on the channel that looked at all the problems and all the issues. Now let's shift channels to something that feels a little more uplifting and leads us feeling grateful and appreciative. And so the templates that we covered today are designed to help you prepare for therapy. That, going to therapy to get more help, it's good to recognize what help you're looking for. And of course, your therapist will help you to discover those things together, but it's always great when you can come a little bit prepared, knowing where some of these issues that you're experiencing lie. So thank you again. It was a pleasure. And we would love for you guys to support us, support the work that we're doing. So if you liked what we did today, please go to therapyjournal.app.app and check us out and try us out too. Thank you and take care.